Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip back in time, all the way to ancient Greece. Imagine you're walking down a cobblestone street, the sun beating down on your shoulders, the sound of sandals slapping against the stone. The air is filled with the smell of herbs and incense, and you're about to step into a world that had a pretty unique way of dealing with health, and let's just say, it's nothing like what you're used to today. In fact, you might find yourself thinking, I don't know if I would have survived the first day here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment below to let me know what city you're in and what time it is over there. I love hearing where you guys are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something pretty fundamental, how ancient Greeks actually viewed health. Now, it wasn't all about sitting in doctors' offices and getting prescriptions like we do today. Health for them was much more holistic, you could say. It was about balance, nature, and the will of the gods. The Greeks didn't just treat symptoms, they looked at a person's entire life, how they lived, what they ate, and, yes, how often they visited the temple. For the Greeks, health was really a divine matter. They believed that illness could be a punishment from the gods. So when you caught a cold or sprained your ankle, you weren't just unlucky, you might have upset one of the many gods that rule over various aspects of life. Each god had their own territory. Hera was the goddess of marriage and family. Apollo was linked to healing and disease. And then there was Asclepius, the god of medicine himself. If you got sick, it was probably best to pray to him, though you might also have to make an offering, which could be anything from a few corns to a whole sheep. Now, if you think that sounds a bit extreme, wait until you hear about the temples built to Asclepius, known as Asclepia. These were not your typical places of worship. They were healing centers where the sick came to pray, sleep, and hopefully wake up cured. Some people even swore they were healed in their sleep after having a dream where Asclepius himself appeared and gave them a remedy. Can you imagine waking up from a dream where a god handed you the cure for your illness? I'd probably be more concerned about my sleeping habits at that point. But hey, they had their ways. Ancient Greeks didn't rely entirely on prayers or dreams, though they also had a rather advanced understanding of diet and exercise. Hippocrates, yes, the father of medicine himself, said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food," which, honestly, isn't the worst advice. For example, they thought eating plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables was key to staying healthy, though I'm pretty sure they didn't include kale on the menu. Their idea of superfoods involved things like figs, olives, and barley, and if you wanted to stay healthy, you didn't just eat right, you moved. Physical activity was a huge part of the Greek lifestyle, with daily exercise in the form of walking, running, or even wrestling in the public gymnasiums. But let's be honest, I'm not sure how much fun it would be to be shoved into a sweaty wrestling match when you're feeling under the weather. Of course, the Greeks also had their fair share of quirks. If you had a sore throat, they might tell you to gargle with something disgusting like vinegar or even wine. While they didn't exactly have modern antibiotics, they were onto something with the whole idea of using natural remedies. Some of their most popular treatments came from local plants, and herbs, garlic, honey, and even a little bit of olive oil were common ingredients for their potions. But the funniest part, some of their healing methods seem more like a mix of science and superstition. For instance, if you had a headache, one cure was to, wait for it, put a piece of bread on your head. I mean, it's not the worst idea. Bread is kind of absorbent, right? But before you get too comfy thinking that ancient Greek medicine was all about strange and quirky solutions, let's talk about something they were dead serious about: the balance of the four humors. This idea came from Hippocrates and later became central to Greek medicine. According to this theory, your body was made up of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If any of these fluids were out of balance, it would lead to disease. Imagine a doctor telling you, hey, your blood is fine, but your phlegm is way off, and you just go, yeah, I've been feeling off about my phlegm lately. I mean, it sounds weird, but the Greeks seriously believed that balancing these fluids was the key to staying healthy. This idea dominated medicine for centuries, and it wasn't until much later that we realized maybe, just maybe, we should think about disease a bit differently. As we dig into this journey, you might find yourself wondering, could I survive in ancient Greece with their treatment methods? Honestly, I'm not sure you'd make it past day one without a serious run-in with their oddball treatments. But hey, at least you wouldn't be bored, right? Alright, now that you've gotten a feel for how the ancient Greeks viewed health, let's dive into something that's truly fascinating and a bit strange when it comes to their approach to disease. The gods, yeah. The Greeks believed that gods didn't just rule over the weather or war, but also the day-to-day stuff like your health. So when you got sick, you didn't just head to the doctor's office. You probably made a detour to the nearest temple to pray for healing. But don't just imagine a simple prayer, oh no. It was far more involved than that. If you were feeling under the weather, you'd head to one of those Asclepius temples I mentioned earlier, and that's where things really start to get interesting. These temples weren't just places of worship. They were more like health resorts, where the sick would come in search of a cure. And the most curious part, they didn't rely on medicine alone. Nope, healing came through dreams, rituals, and, yes, divine intervention. Now, if you had a specific ailment, you might make an offering to the god of your choice. Had a nasty fever, you'd pray to Apollo, the god of healing and disease. Feeling sluggish, there was always the goddess Hygeia, who was all about maintaining health. But the real star of the show, when it came to healing, was Asclepius. He was the son of Apollo and had a serious reputation for curing diseases. The thing about Asclepius was that he wasn't just a god of medicine. He was also a god who had his own special healing abilities. He had the power to bring people back from the dead, a pretty big deal, if you ask me. And it's said that he even trained a snake to help him heal people. Yep, snakes, those slithery little creatures that most of us try to avoid, were actually considered sacred healers in Greek mythology. Imagine going to a temple, lying down on a stone floor, and being surrounded by people in a similar state of discomfort, all hoping for the divine touch of a god. The priests would help guide you through a ritual that involved both prayers and offerings, but the real healing was expected to come through your dreams. Ancient texts suggest that Asclepius himself would appear in dreams and give the sick person a remedy, sort of like receiving a prescription, except with way more divine flair. Honestly, I'm not sure how I'd feel about going to sleep and hoping a god would show up to fix my ailments, but hey, it worked for some people. Speaking of dreams, let's talk about how they really fit into the healing process. You see, these temples were full of people trying to cure everything from mild colds to serious injuries. And while they might have started off with some prayers, the real magic was in the healing sleep. People would sleep in the temple overnight, hoping to be visited by Asclepius or one of his healing snakes in their dreams. These weren't just nice dreams, they were seen as direct communication from the gods. And while modern medicine might not back up the dream remedy, I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't love a good sleep cure after a long day. Now, if you didn't find relief in your dreams, don't worry, there were still other methods. You could try various rituals, like bathing in sacred waters or drinking healing potions made from herbs and other natural ingredients. And let us not forget the infamous snake. Priests would often let a sacred snake wander over your body during the healing process. No word on whether that was relaxing or terrifying, but it certainly made the whole process a bit more dramatic. And speaking of dramatic, some accounts even suggest that the sick would be told to perform acts of sacrifice, like leaving food or treasure at the altar in exchange for their health. I mean, that sounds like a pretty intense version of paying for a prescription. But it's not just about the rituals or the divine intervention. There were real, down-to-earth remedies that the Greeks believed worked too. We're talking about things like using wine for wound care, yes, really, or applying poultices made from various plants. While not all of their remedies would pass today's medical standards, they had a pretty solid grasp on some basic concepts like cleanliness and herbal medicine. Their approach to healing was far more than just divine will. It was also about a balance between nature, mind, and body. Still, it's not all roses and healing miracles. Despite their faith in the gods, Greek medicine was also rooted in a deep understanding of the human body. The famous physician Hippocrates often called the father of Western medicine, took a more practical approach, advocating for diet, exercise, and observing the patient closely. The Greeks realized that health wasn't just about appeasing the gods, it also required paying attention to what the body needed. And let's be real, when you're lying on a cold temple floor, hoping for a god to show up, you might start thinking twice about the whole diet and exercise thing. Still, this mixture of the divine and the practical helped lay the foundation for what would become Western medicine. The really interesting part is that, even though the gods were a central part of their healing process, the Greeks didn't rely on them entirely. They were practical enough to know that sometimes it took more than a good dream or a sacrifice to get better. They also worked with nature, combining the divine with what was available in their world: plants, animals, and even simple lifestyle changes. And though modern medicine has come a long way since then, there's still something charming about the ancient Greeks' willingness to blend the mystical with the scientific. Now that we've had a taste of how the Greeks use divine powers to heal, let's dive into the foundations of ancient Greek medicine itself. If you're thinking this will be all about weird gods and snake rituals, well, we're not quite done with that yet, but there's actually a lot of practical knowledge in what the Greeks believed about the human body. And let's be honest, some of it might just make you nod and think, hey, they weren't that far off. The big question is, how did the Greeks approach medicine when they weren't waiting for gods to show up in their dreams? Well, first of all, they didn't just look at symptoms in isolation. Instead, they took a holistic view of the human body. The Greeks believed that the body was made up of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if you're wondering what on earth any of that has to do with your current state of health, well, I'm right there with you. But the idea was that these humors needed to be in perfect balance for someone to be healthy. Too much blood, for example, could lead to too much warmth in the body, and too much phlegm meant you were sluggish and overly cold. Basically, they thought of your body like a living pot of soup, and if the ingredients were out of whack, well, you'd start to feel it. So how did they try to balance the humors? You guessed it: diet, exercise, and even a little bloodletting. Yes, bloodletting. Now, before you go thinking it was just some random practice to make you feel worse, it actually made sense at the time. The Greeks believed that bleeding someone out was a way to cool down an overheated body. They weren't too far off on the idea that too much of something in the body could be problematic. But you can imagine how much fun it was for a patient who had to get a little bit of their blood drained to cure a cold. Now, if you were lucky enough to avoid the bloodletting, there was still a lot of focus on what you ate. Food wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was seen as an essential part of staying healthy. Hippocrates, yes, the same guy we mentioned earlier, believed that food could cure disease. His motto was pretty simple: let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. He was way ahead of his time. Really, while modern medicine leans on pharmaceuticals and surgical procedures, Hippocrates was out here thinking, hey, why not just eat a healthy meal? So for common ailments like a sore throat or stomach trouble, the Greeks might have prescribed a diet of barley, honey, or figs. Yes, figs. They swore by these fruits as a way to cleanse the body and restore balance. Speaking of balancing the body, you couldn't just sit around eating figs all day and expect to stay healthy. You also needed to move. Greeks were huge on exercise, and their gyms were the place to be if you wanted to maintain your physical health. But it wasn't all about lifting weights or running marathons. They believed in moderation, a balanced workout routine. If you will, too much physical activity could throw your humors out of whack, and too little could leave you weak. Finding that sweet spot between laziness and overexertion was key. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to think the Greeks might have been onto something with their moderation mantra. If only I could remember that the next time I decide to skip the gym for a week or two. Of course, there were still some weird practices along the way. For example, one method for curing coughs involved drinking a remedy made from a mix of honey and vinegar, which, if you ask me, sounds more like a salad dressing than a medicine. But again, the Greeks were ahead of their time in some ways, so maybe they knew something we don't. They also experimented with a ton of different herbs and plants, things like mint, oregano, and garlic to treat everything from digestive problems to skin issues. I think we're starting to see a bit of a trend here. The Greeks were all about using what nature gave them, and their connection to the earth was as much a part of their medicine as the gods themselves. But there's another interesting thing to note about their approach to health. Their belief that a healthy mind led to a healthy body. They didn't just look at physical symptoms. They believed that mental and emotional balance were just as important. This is where things get a bit more philosophical. While modern medicine tends to compartmentalize the body and mind, the Greeks thought you needed both to be in harmony for a truly healthy existence. So if you were stressed out, anxious, or depressed, it wasn't just about treating the symptoms, it was about restoring your balance in all aspects of life. Some doctors in ancient Greece even used music to help treat patients, especially those suffering from stress or mental illness. I'm not sure how effective a harp solo would be in curing your anxiety, but hey, it's a creative approach, right? To wrap up this chapter, it's clear that the Greeks were far from primitive in their understanding of medicine. In fact, many of their ideas laid the groundwork for modern medicine, though we've certainly moved past the whole bloodletting thing. They recognized that health wasn't just about fixing one thing at a time, it was about balancing everything. And while some of their remedies may seem a little weird, garlic for everything, the way they saw the connection between mind, body, and the world around them, something that still resonates today. If anything, it teaches us that maybe we could all use a little more balance in our lives, though I think I'll pass on the honey vinegar concoction now that we've explored some of the more practical aspects of ancient Greek medicine. Let's get a bit more specific about what it was like to actually be a patient in those days. Imagine this. You're feeling sick, and instead of scrolling through endless health advice on your phone, you're walking into a physician's office, more like a humble little space, and preparing for an ancient treatment experience that, frankly, might make you wish you could go back to just coughing in peace. First off, let's talk about who exactly you'd be seeing if you were unlucky enough to need medical attention. Now, we know that the Greeks had a pretty wide range of medical professionals, but not everyone could claim to be a full-on doctor. There were basically two categories, the physicians and the healers. The physicians were like the real deal. They studied anatomy and physiology, had formal training, and followed a code of ethics, much like doctors today. But let's be clear, they didn't have stethoscopes or MRI machines. Instead, they used their eyes, hands, and judgment to diagnose you. Imagine going to a doctor today and having them just look you up and down and say, "Yep, you've got the flu," without any fancy tests. It was all about the art of observation. Then there were the healers, often referred to as folk or lay doctors, who didn't necessarily have formal training, but used more traditional methods passed down from generation to generation. They were like the village practitioners, sometimes using herbal remedies, potions, and more mystical practices that had a heavy dose of hope works in them. These healers were often more trusted by the common folk, though, because they were more accessible, and honestly, they didn't charge you as much for their services. This is a good point to note. The more educated physicians tended to be expensive, and getting the best care could mean paying through the nose or perhaps even offering a sacrifice to the gods for divine favor. At least when you go to the doctor today, you don't have to worry about bringing a goat along to pay for your treatment, right? The treatments themselves were a mix of the sophisticated and the, let's just say creative. I'm sure you've heard of things like bloodletting and herbal remedies, but let's talk about some of the more bizarre treatments that people actually believe in. For example, let's say you had a stomach issue. A Greek physician might recommend you drink a concoction made from crushed snails. Yes, snails. Who would have thought? The thinking behind this was that snails had properties that could soothe your digestive system. It sounds weird, but hey, some modern remedies aren't all that different. Drink a glass of warm lemon water isn't exactly gourmet either. Another interesting treatment was exercises for the soul. That's right, while you're lying there with your ailment, you might be told to perform mental exercises to help you imagine yourself healing. This wasn't just about relaxation, it was about using the power of your mind to change your body's condition. The Greeks were ahead of their time with this idea, mixing a bit of psychological healing with physical treatment. Today, we know this as the mind-body connection, and while the Greeks didn't have fancy terms for it, They certainly had some methods to back it up, but let's not forget one of the most important and at times horrifying aspects of Greek treatment. Surgery, yes, surgery. The Greeks weren't shy about using the knife, especially in the case of more serious injuries. For example, if you had a wound that needed stitching, you were in for a rather uncomfortable experience. Surgeons in ancient Greece didn't have anesthetics, so they relied on alcohol to numb the pain, which, depending on how much you drank, could either help you get through the procedure or make you feel like you were at a party. The cutting itself, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly neat. You might leave with a scar that was more of a reminder of the good old days than a surgical fix. But incredibly, some of their surgeries were pretty successful. The Greeks had a basic understanding of how to treat bone fractures and perform amputations, which was no small feat in a world without modern medical tools. Speaking of surgeries, let's talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient medicine, the use of trepanation. Now, before you freak out, let me clarify. Trepanation was the practice of drilling a hole in your skull. Sounds terrifying, right? Well, the Greeks and various other ancient cultures believed that trepanation would cure everything from headaches to mental illness. The theory was that by drilling a hole, you could release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. While modern medicine doesn't exactly support the evil spirits theory, trepanation was actually used in some cases to treat injuries like skull fractures. The scary part is that, even though there was no anesthesia, many patients survived the procedure. Still, I'm going to guess that if you had a headache back then, you'd probably prefer to just stick with some herbal tea. Thanks. Now, let's get back to something a little less grim. The medicine cabinets of the Greeks. If you were lucky enough to get a prescription from a physician or even a healer, it was likely to be made up of natural substances, mostly herbs and plants, along with a mix of things that might make you raise an eyebrow. Some of the most common medicinal ingredients included honey, olive oil, wine, and the odd bit of crushed animal bones. And while modern medicine might not endorse the use of crushed bones for a headache, many of these natural remedies had their merits. Honey, for example, is still used in some modern medicine for its antibacterial properties, and olive oil is known for its healing effects on skin conditions. The Greeks were essentially the OGs of using natural ingredients for healing, and some of their remedies still hold up today. So while the treatment process may have been a little, let's say, unpredictable, the Greeks certainly laid the foundation for a lot of the medical practices we rely on today. They understood that health wasn't just about fixing symptoms, it was about understanding the body, experimenting with nature, and using everything at their disposal to find a cure. Sure, you might not want to try some of these treatments now, but there's no denying the ingenuity of their approach. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll rediscover something ancient and say, hey, the Greeks were right. Okay, so we've covered some of the more traditional methods of Greek medicine. Now it is time to talk about something that is just as important to health, the social and cultural aspects of being sick in ancient Greece. Spoiler alert. Being unwell back then wasn't just about finding the right remedy or medicine. It also came with a hefty dose of social pressure, public stigma, and philosophical musings about life and death. Yes, you were sick, but you were also a cultural symbol in a society that valued both physical prowess and mental discipline. Let's dive into the quirky intersection of health, social status, and Greek philosophy. Let's start with one little thing that might surprise you. Greeks believed that being sick wasn't just a random occurrence, it was often a moral issue. Yes, if you were ill, some people might believe it was because you had wronged the gods or lived a life of excess. Sound familiar? It's like the ancient version of your grandmother telling you that your cold was because you went out with wet hair. In the Greek worldview, your body was a reflection of your mind and spirit. So, if you were unhealthy, it might mean that something was off not just in your body, but in your character. Talk about pressure. For the wealthy, this created a rather unique social dilemma. You see, the upper class didn't just want to be physically well. They also wanted to appear healthy. Their appearance was a sign of their moral virtue and strength. Think of it like the Greek version of today's social media influencers who never let you forget their wellness routine. For them, being ill wasn't just about feeling bad, it was about losing face. It was socially embarrassing to be sick, and it might even be seen as a failure of self-control. So if you were rich and caught a cold, you could bet it wasn't just your physician and healer who'd be paying attention. It would be your whole circle of friends, neighbors, and even business associates. Imagine trying to throw a party while being side-eyed for sneezing a few times, but that doesn't mean the poor had it any easier. In fact, their illness came with its own set of challenges. For the lower classes, being sick wasn't just about bad luck or a moral failing. It was often a matter of survival. Think about it. You're working the land, lifting heavy things, or doing physically demanding tasks, and then you catch a cold or worse, an infection. For the poor, illness wasn't something you could easily bounce back from. Without access to trained physicians, proper medicine, or even clean water, which we'll get to in a second, a minor illness could quickly spiral into something deadly. The poor didn't have the luxury of sitting at home sipping tea and getting pampered. They had to keep working, even when they felt like death was knocking at their door. It's easy to forget that in a society that praised physical and mental resilience, illness could be a luxury you couldn't afford to indulge in. And if you think that's the worst of it, well, let's talk about public health in ancient Greece. We tend to think of ancient cities as charming, but the truth is, they were often downright filthy. There was no plumbing, no running water, and most people didn't even have the luxury of a simple hand-washing station. If you lived in Athens or Sparta, you had to deal with public spaces that weren't just full of people, they were full of germs. Think about it. Crowded marketplaces, shared communal bathrooms, if you were lucky, and streets where trash piled up with no real sanitation system. It was a recipe for the spread of diseases like dysentery, cholera, and other infections that we wouldn't wish on our worst enemies. In fact, public health was such a big problem that the Greek physician Hippocrates himself wrote about the connection between the environment and diseases long before people understood bacteria or viruses. And of course, this lack of sanitation was particularly dangerous for the children of Greece. If you were born into a lower-class family, you had a significantly higher chance of dying from something as simple as a cold or fever, simply because there was no way to treat it properly. The Greeks, for all their wisdom, still didn't have antibiotics, antiseptics, or vaccines to keep these diseases at bay. For the rich, they might be able to isolate themselves from the filth of the city, but for everyone else, sickness was a constant threat. It's easy to romanticize the past, but sometimes it was a pretty tough place to live. Now, let's talk about how the Greeks approached death itself. It was inevitable, of course, but for the Greeks, death wasn't just a final event, it was a big idea. The Greeks were obsessed with the concept of the afterlife and how they would be remembered once they were gone. In fact, the concept of a proper burial and the ritual surrounding death were almost as important as life itself. There were specific ways to handle the body after death, including cleansing, anointing with oils, and offering sacrifices to ensure the soul could safely cross over to the afterlife. If you didn't follow these rituals, it was believed your soul would wander aimlessly, trapped between worlds. It's a nice touch of poetic thinking, but also a lot of pressure to make sure you die correctly, don't you think? The Greeks also saw death as a mystery. Some believed that death was the final end, your soul just ceased to be, while others, like Plato, had more metaphysical ideas. He believed that the soul was immortal and would live on after the body died, which probably gave people some comfort when they were sick and facing their own mortality. Still, the thought of death was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of their medical practices. You could be treated for a broken leg or an upset stomach, but ultimately, everyone knew that death would come for them eventually, and there wasn't much you could do to stop it. As much as the Greeks may have romanticized life and death, though they certainly weren't shy about embracing the idea that life was short and it was a gift to be appreciated. Maybe it's a little too poetic for some, but you've got to admit, it's a pretty healthy outlook on things. Death was always around, but the Greeks decided to live with it, not in fear of it. So next time you feel sick, just think, at least you don't have to worry about having the right kind of funeral rites or whether you've properly appeased the gods to avoid becoming a wandering ghost. You've got access to good health care and a simple visit to the doctor, not to mention no need to consider Whether your sick day will make you a moral pariah, things are definitely looking up. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's just as essential to your health as any treatment or remedy: diet. Yes, the Greeks had some interesting ideas about food, and believe me, they were passionate about it. Whether you were rich or poor, a philosopher or a soldier, food was central to every aspect of Greek life. But don't get too comfortable, because what they considered healthy eating might leave you scratching your head. First off, let's talk about the Greeks' main meal. If you were living in ancient Greece, the day would typically revolve around two meals: a light breakfast and a bigger dinner. Breakfast was usually something simple, like bread and olives, maybe with a side of cheese or some dried fruit. Think of it like the world's oldest version of the Mediterranean diet, but minus all the smoothie bowls and chia seeds. The focus wasn't on being fancy, it was just about fueling up for the day's work. Now, dinner was a bit more of a production. It wasn't just about filling your stomach, it was about creating a social event. Picture this: a group of people sitting around a low table, eating together, chatting about philosophy, politics, or the latest Olympic Games. But while the Greeks may have been known for their party vibes, their meals were often fairly light. The typical dinner would include a combination of grains, vegetables, and fish. Meat was not as common, especially for everyday meals, because it was expensive and mostly reserved for special occasions. Lamb, goat, and pork were the popular meats when they were available, but for the most part, the average Greek had to get by on bread, vegetables, and whatever fruits were in season. Speaking of bread, let's talk about one of the most important foods in the Greek diet: barley. Yes, barley was the real MVP of Greek cuisine. Barley bread was a staple, especially for the lower classes. In fact, it was so central to their diet that it's no wonder they saw it as more than just food. It was practically a symbol of life itself. Barley was affordable, easy to store, and packed a lot of calories for its weight. You didn't need a fancy oven to bake either, just a fire and a little creativity. And while we may associate bread with carbs and guilt today, for the Greeks, it was the foundation of their diet, giving them the energy they needed for their busy, often physically demanding lives. But let's not forget about wine. Oh yes, the Greeks were very fond of their wine. In fact, they probably drank more wine than water, and I'm not exaggerating here. Wine was consumed daily, and it was so ingrained in Greek culture that they even had gods dedicated to it, like Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was a way of life. However, Greek wine wasn't quite like the stuff we sip at dinner parties today. It was diluted with water, sometimes as much as 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This was to reduce the alcohol content and make the drinking experience last longer. They didn't just drink to get drunk. They drank to enjoy the social atmosphere, the conversation, and the slow burn of good company. So, if you think that glass of wine at dinner makes you feel a little fancy, just remember it's nothing compared to a Greek symposium where wine flowed like, well, wine. Speaking of wine and those long conversations, Greeks didn't just eat for survival, they ate for intellectual stimulation. The act of dining was an important social and philosophical event. When rich Athenians held a dinner party, they'd often bring in a symposiarch, a sort of party host, philosopher who would guide the conversation. Dinner and debate were intimately linked, and the sharing of ideas was as important as the sharing of food. You might think, that's great and all, but what if you just want to eat and not talk about the meaning of life? Well, too bad. In the Greek world, food for thought was just as important as the food on your plate. Now, let's get to the slightly weird side of Greek food habits. Remember, while they ate a lot of bread and vegetables, they didn't have the hygiene standards we have today. So here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks weren't just known for their love of simple food, they also had some strange ideas about food hygiene and preservation. For example, one of their favorite methods for keeping food fresh or safe to eat, depending on your perspective, was the art of pickling. Foods like fish, vegetables, and even fruits were pickled in vinegar and salt, preserving them for long periods. While pickles are still a popular snack today, the Greeks' pickled goods were strong. Imagine biting into a brined fish or a salted cucumber after a long day. Sounds like a quick way to clear your sinuses, doesn't it? One food trend that might leave you scratching your head was the Greeks' love for garum, a fermented fish sauce that was used as a seasoning on almost everything. They'd take fish, salt them, and let them ferment for months to create a thick, pungent sauce. It was essentially the ancient Greek version of today's soy sauce or hot sauce, and they put it on everything: meat, fish, vegetables, and even their bread. Honestly, I don't know how they managed to have dinner parties without the entire room smelling like an ocean floor, but somehow they did it. Garum was so popular that it became a major trade product, and people even had different qualities of it. Much like how we rate wines or olive oils today, you could have cheap, mass-produced garum or high-quality, artisanal garum if you had enough money. But for all their focus on food and diet, the Greeks weren't immune to the occasional food-related disasters. One of the more bizarre aspects of ancient Greek dining involved the Feast of the Gods, where they actually offer up food as sacrifices to their deities. The idea was that the gods would feast on the aroma of the food, leaving the actual meal for the humans. Honestly, it's kind of like having a potluck where no one eats the food except the Greeks thought that by doing so they could please the gods and ensure good health for everyone. Finally, let's take a moment to appreciate the Greek approach to balance when it came to health. You see, the Greeks were really into the idea of moderation. They believed in eating, drinking, and living in balance, which might sound like an Instagram post, but it was genuinely a core principle of their way of life. While some cultures would advocate for indulgence or total restraint, the Greeks took a more Goldilocks approach. Don't do too much, but don't do too little either. It was the sweet spot of health, where you neither gorged yourself into oblivion nor deprived yourself of pleasure. It might not have been perfect, but it was a whole lot better than drinking 3 lattes before breakfast and ignoring your vegetables. So the next time you think about your health or your diet, take a page out of the ancient Greeks' book. You don't need to eat like them. But hey, moderation, a little wine, and a good social gathering never hurt anyone, right? All right, we've talked about the Greeks' diet, their social pressures, and some of the more quirky aspects of their health. But there's one thing we haven't fully delved into yet: the actual medical practices that the Greeks use to cure or at least manage their illnesses. And trust me, it's a journey. From simple herbal remedies to strange rituals, the way they approach healing was nothing short of interesting. So let's get comfy and explore how the ancient Greeks tried to heal the body and what they believed might actually work. First up, the father of Western medicine, Hippocrates. This guy wasn't just a doctor, he was a pioneer. His name is still associated with medicine today. You've probably heard of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. But despite his long-lasting legacy, Hippocrates wasn't exactly modern in his approach. In fact, he was pretty much the OG proponent of using a scientific method in medicine. What do I mean by that? Well, Hippocrates was one of the first to reject the idea that diseases were caused by angry gods or supernatural forces. Instead, he believed that diseases had natural causes, like imbalances in the body's humors, those bodily fluids, such as blood, phlegm, and bile. This was a groundbreaking thought in a time when most people believed illness came from curses or divine punishment. Hippocrates' theories might seem a little outdated now, but they had an enormous impact on the development of medicine. For instance, he suggested that a balanced diet and proper rest were essential for good health, which, as it turns out, is not far off from what modern doctors would tell you. But let's be real. Even Hippocrates had some interesting methods of treatment that don't exactly stand the test of time. For example, if you were suffering from a fever, Hippocrates might prescribe you something called bloodletting. Yep, they would literally drain some of your blood in the hopes of restoring balance. And, spoiler alert, this rarely worked and often made people feel worse. But hey, back then, it probably seemed like a decent solution. They didn't have antibiotics or modern medicine, after all. And then there was the whole humors theory. If you had too much blood, you were considered to be overly sanguine, which sounds delightful, but it meant you were thought to be too cheerful or optimistic for your own good. If you had too much bile, you were seen as choleric, a grumpy, fiery person. Too much phlegm, well, that made you phlegmatic, which meant you were lazy and sluggish. They didn't really know what germs were yet, so balancing out your humors was their go-to treatment plan. If you felt off, it wasn't just about the symptoms, it was a sign that your entire body's balance had been disturbed. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the actual treatments they used, and believe me, some of them were pretty wild by today's standards. Herbs, for instance, were a huge part of Greek medicine. The ancient Greeks had a vast knowledge of plants, and they used a wide variety of them for medicinal purposes. Things like thyme, sage, and lavender were common staples, and they believed that certain plants could have almost magical properties. Some of their remedies might actually work, like using willow bark to ease pain, which, fun fact, contains compounds similar to modern-day aspirin. But other remedies, well, they were a little more, let's say, experimental. For instance, if you had a headache, one of the treatments might have involved applying a mixture of herbs and moldy bread to your forehead. Yes, you read that right, moldy bread. Apparently, the mold was thought to have some healing properties. We now know that mold contains fungi which can be toxic, but in the ancient world they had no clue about that. Still, if you had a headache and it didn't work, at least you'd get to test out your immune system in the process. And then there's the one thing you definitely don't want to try at home. Greek doctors often used incantations and rituals as part of the healing process. This wasn't just about medicine, it was about spiritual healing too. So, if you had an ailment that wasn't responding to regular treatments, the Greek healers might perform some sort of prayer or ritual to invoke the gods' favor. Imagine having to sit there while your doctor chanted over you to appease the gods of health. If you were lucky, you might get some nice oils and massages as part of the process, but the real treatment was meant to be spiritual healing. It was basically an early version of good vibes only. But let's not forget the role of temples in Greek medicine. If you wanted the best healing, you'd make a pilgrimage to a temple dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. These temples weren't just places of worship, they were full-on hospitals where people came to be healed. You'd sleep in the temple overnight, and during that time, you'd receive visions or dreams supposedly sent by Asclepius himself about how to treat your illness. Some people reported feeling better after these divine visits, whether it was because of the spiritual experience or just the rest and relaxation. We may never know, but the real kicker when it came to Greek medicine was the role of surgery. Yes, ancient Greece had surgeons, and they did some pretty impressive work for their time. Some of them could perform surgeries on broken bones or even treat battle wounds. But the thought of surgery back then probably wasn't nearly as glamorous as it is today. For one thing, anesthesia wasn't a thing, so surgeries were often done with the patient wide awake, which sounds uncomfortable to say the least. That said, they had some serious skills when it came to fixing fractures or treating dislocations. But like with most things in ancient medicine, it was a bit of trial and error. And let's not even talk about dental care. Greek dentists were probably the bravest people around. Teeth were extracted without the benefit of modern techniques, and fillings were made from materials like honey and wax. Sure, it might have worked in a pinch, but can you imagine going to the dentist and having them pull your teeth out by hand while you're wide awake? In all honesty, the Greeks did a lot of things right, and their focus on the balance of the body and mind is still something we consider important today. But when it came to some of their medical treatments, well, let's just say you might want to stick with your modern doctor next time you're feeling under the weather. So we've covered diet, medicine, and a little bit of ancient surgical drama. But what about how the Greeks dealt with the stuff we often associate with modern medicine, like stress, anxiety, and the infamous sleepless nights? Believe it or not, the ancient Greeks had their own ways of managing the everyday pressures of life. And while it wasn't always effective, it certainly gives us a glimpse into how they thought about mental health long before it became a mainstream topic. Let's kick it off with a concept you may have heard of: eudaimonia. In Greek philosophy, this term translates roughly to flourishing or living your best life. But it's not just about having fun. It's about achieving a state of balance and happiness through living a life of virtue. If you lived according to reason, your life would be fulfilling, simple, right? Well, not so much. You could spend your entire life trying to achieve this state, and it's not exactly something you could check off your to-do list. But the idea was that if you found balance, whether it was in relationships, work, or leisure, you could achieve peace of mind. And as we'll see, this idea really influenced the Greeks' approach to mental health. However, not all Greeks were sold on this vision of perfect balance. Take Diogenes, for example, a philosopher known for his wild antics and disregard for social conventions. Diogenes wasn't exactly the type to sip chamomile tea and reflect on his feelings. In fact, he often shunned the pursuit of pleasure in favor of the purest form of freedom, living without stress. He lived in a barrel, publicly mocked people's obsessions with material wealth, and argued that the key to true happiness was letting go of societal expectations. You could almost think of him as the ancient world's version of a self-care rebel. If your stress was coming from societal pressures, Diogenes would probably tell you to get rid of all your stuff, live in a barrel, and embrace your inner philosopher. But not all Greeks took such an extreme approach. Aristotle, for example, recommended that people combat stress by practicing the golden mean. This idea was all about avoiding extremes in every area of life. Too much of anything, whether it's eating, drinking, or even intellectual pursuits, was bad for your well-being. In a way, Aristotle was like the original self-help guru, emphasizing moderation as the key to mental balance. For instance, if you were stressed about your job or your family, Aristotle would probably suggest you take a step back, reflect, and find a calm middle ground. After all, balance equals happiness. So, how did the ancient Greeks physically deal with their stress, especially when it came to unwinding and getting a good night's sleep? Well, let's just say their techniques were a bit different from the soothing, lavender-scented spot treatments we have today. First off, baths. They were a huge deal in ancient Greece. We tend to associate baths with relaxation today, and the Greeks were all over this trend. They had these luxurious public bathhouses where people would spend hours soaking, chatting, and letting off steam. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about relaxation and socializing. If you were feeling stressed or needed a mental reset, a trip to the bathhouse might have been just what you needed. But unlike today's serene spa environments, these bathhouses were lively and full of people. It's like being in a sauna full of gossiping philosophers. Not exactly the peaceful retreat we imagine today, but effective nonetheless. Then there's the music. Yes, you read that right. The Greeks believed in the power of music to calm the mind. Instruments like the lyre and the aulos, kind of like a flute, were used to create soothing melodies during social events and even during healing rituals. Music wasn't just a form of entertainment. It was considered a legitimate tool for mental well-being. Imagine sitting around after a long day, listening to a lyre being strummed, the soft, melodic notes floating through the air. Sounds relaxing, right? While their tunes might not exactly top the modern charts, the idea of using music for relaxation is timeless. Speaking of relaxation, let's also talk about Greek meditation. Wait, what? You didn't think meditation was a modern phenomenon, did you? Well, the Greeks had their own version, and it wasn't about chanting Om or sitting in lotus pose. Instead, Greek philosophers practiced reflection, a method where you'd ponder your actions, your decisions, and your life in a calm, thoughtful manner. It wasn't quite the same as what we think of as modern meditation, but it had similar benefits. By reflecting on your actions, they believed you could clear your mind and reduce anxiety. And of course, there's the Greek approach to sleep itself. The Greeks were keenly aware of the importance of sleep. After all, they just spent all day philosophizing, fighting wars, and debating the meaning of life. Naturally, they understood that rest was essential. So, what did they do? They would often pray to Hypnos, the god of sleep, for a peaceful slumber. I mean, if you're having trouble falling asleep, why not ask the god of dreams to help you out? The Greeks also had a belief that sleep and dreams were linked to the divine. They believed that sleep was a way to reconnect with the gods, and that dreams were messages or visions from the divine realm. But, much like us, not all Greeks had an easy time with sleep. In fact, the famed philosopher Aristotle himself wrote about the effects of sleeplessness, noting that too much sleep was just as unhealthy as too little. It's like he was trying to tell us all, guys, get your beauty sleep, but don't overdo it. The Greeks were also obsessed with the quality of sleep. It wasn't enough to just get 8 hours. They believed that sleep needed to be dream-filled and restorative, giving you insights into your life or even allowing you to communicate with the gods. In the end, the Greeks had a pretty holistic approach to dealing with stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. They didn't have today's technology, but they did have philosophy, music, rituals, and lots of baths. So next time you're feeling a bit stressed, think of how the ancient Greeks might have handled it. Maybe throw on some soft music, take a warm bath, and reflect on your day with maybe a glass of wine, of course. All right, we're diving deeper into the world of ancient Greek healing, and this time we're tackling a pretty interesting aspect: spiritual health. You see, while the Greeks were known for their rational thinkers like Hippocrates and Aristotle, they also had a significant spiritual side to their health practices. In fact, if you were sick, you didn't just go to the doctor or healer, you might also head to a temple. Yes, the Greeks were firm believers that your health wasn't just about physical imbalances. It was also about the state of your soul. So, let's settle in, because this is where things get mystical. One of the most famous healing practices in ancient Greece was the concept of Asclepius, the god of medicine. People didn't just see him as a god, they treated him like a spiritual doctor. If you were unwell or suffering from an illness that regular medicine couldn't fix, you'd make a pilgrimage to one of Asclepius' temples, where healing was as much about the mind and spirit as it was about the body. You might have heard of Asclepius before. His symbol is still used in modern medicine today, the staff entwined by a serpent. But what you might not know is that in ancient Greece, temples dedicated to Asclepius were more like the equivalent of modern hospitals. But instead of sterile rooms and modern technology, these places were filled with rituals, offerings, and, most notably, dreams. You see, the Greeks believed that the god Asclepius would often appear to people in their dreams, offering healing advice or guidance. These visions weren't just random thoughts. They were considered divine messages, and the temples often had sleeping chambers where patients would rest and receive healing dreams. Imagine this: you're sick, maybe even at your wit's end, so you go to one of these sacred temples, lay down, and wait for Asclepius to visit you in your sleep. If you were lucky, you might wake up with a prescription, literally a divine prescription, that might be a ritual or a special diet or something specific to your condition. Some people even claim to be cured by these divine dreams alone. But what's even wilder? Healing snakes. Yep, you heard that right. In some temples of Asclepius, there were sacred snakes known as epidoros, snakes which were believed to possess magical healing powers. People would sleep near the snakes or even let them slither around them in the hopes of receiving divine healing. Now, I don't know about you, but if I woke up to a snake casually coiling around my legs, I don't think I'd feel all that healed. But in the Greek world, it was seen as a sign of divine intervention. You could say the Greeks were the original proponents of snake therapy, minus the whole slithering reptile thing. If you didn't fancy snakes, though, the temples still had other forms of spiritual healing. You could offer sacrifices to the gods, make prayers, or take part in purification rituals. There were even dream interpreters at some of the temples who would analyze the meaning of your visions to give you a clearer path to recovery. It was like ancient Greece's version of a self-help book, only this one came from the gods. Now, not everyone in ancient Greece agreed with these divine remedies. Some of the more rational philosophers like Plato were skeptical of such practices. They believed that everything could be explained through logic and reason, and didn't trust divine intervention as a cure for illness. Still, there was a huge following of people who sought out the gods for healing, and many temples boasted success stories of miraculous cures, with people returning from their journeys feeling better, or at least convinced that their healing had come through the power of the divine. One of the best-known Asclepius temples was in Epidaurus, a place so popular that pilgrims from all over the Greek world would travel there just for the chance to sleep in the temple and receive guidance. It was an ancient version of a wellness retreat, but with a lot more sacrifices and serpents. The temple in Epidaurus became so famous for its healing powers that it attracted people from far beyond Greece, reaching as far as Egypt and Rome. In fact, Some of the greatest minds of the time, like Galen, one of the most influential Roman physicians, were influenced by the healing practices associated with Asclepius. But what if you were one of those people who just couldn't get with the whole sleep and snakes approach? Well, the Greeks also had something else up their sleeves: rituals and superstitions. We're talking about things like using amulets, wearing charms, or invoking specific gods depending on what you were sick with. If you had a headache, you might pray to Apollo. If you had a wound, you'd appeal to the god of war, Ares. Yes, you'd probably have to get through his temper before he helps you out, though, interestingly enough, some of these rituals were actually more of a psychological comfort than a physical cure. People believe that by invoking the gods or using charms, they were bringing themselves into alignment with divine order. It didn't necessarily heal the body, but it calmed the mind, kind of like the placebo effect we hear so much about today. But I won't deny, there's something comforting about the idea of being able to place your worries on the gods, knowing that you weren't facing your illness alone. But no matter what method you went with, whether you visited a temple, consulted a philosopher, or just trusted your good old home remedies, one thing is clear: healing in ancient Greece was as much about faith and belief as it was about medicine. In some ways, that may sound strange to us today, but the Greeks knew something that we sometimes forget. When it comes to your health, having a little faith, or at least a sense of hope, can sometimes be just as important as the physical treatments themselves. All right, we've seen how the ancient Greeks approached their physical and spiritual health. But now let's take a closer look at a practice that might surprise you: ancient Greek surgery. Yes, you heard that right. While we often think of ancient medicine as being primitive or even barbaric, the Greeks were actually ahead of their time in some ways, especially when it came to surgical procedures. Now, don't expect any of these operations to have been performed under sterile conditions. Those didn't exist back then, but the techniques they used were surprisingly sophisticated. So let's dive in, shall we? To start off, one of the most famous Greek physicians who dabbled in surgery was Hippocrates. You know, the guy who gave us the Hippocratic Oath. This guy wasn't just about writing medical theories, he was also into the practical application of them. Hippocrates wrote extensively about surgical procedures, many of which were groundbreaking at the time. For example, he developed methods for setting broken bones, treating fractures, and even performing trepanation, which was the practice of drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries. While this may sound like something out of a horror movie, back in ancient Greece, it was considered cutting edge. The idea was that by creating a hole in the skull, you'd release the evil spirits or pressure causing the problem, something we now understand in modern medicine as the need to relieve cranial pressure. But don't get too freaked out yet. Not every Greek surgery involved drilling into your skull. For the less extreme cases, there were more familiar procedures like amputations or treating wounds. Ancient Greek surgeons, or iatroi as they were called, used a variety of tools that resemble what we might see in a modern-day surgical toolkit. There were scalpels for cutting, forceps for gripping, and even a version of a surgical needle for stitching wounds. These tools weren't as refined as modern-day instruments, but they were functional enough to perform life-saving surgeries, especially considering the resources they had available. For the most part, though, Greek surgery was really more about treating injuries sustained in battle. You could say that the warrior mentality dominated Greek medicine in many ways. If you were a soldier, you would likely receive the most advanced care available at the time, especially if you had the misfortune of getting injured in a battle. In fact, there are records of Greek surgeons traveling with armies to tend to the wounded, so if you happened to be a warrior in the Greek military, you might have had access to better care than your average farmer or merchant. Lucky you, right? But here's where it gets a little more interesting. Greek surgery also involved some pretty bizarre treatments. For instance, there was the use of honey in surgery. Honey was considered a miracle cure for many things in the ancient world, including wounds. Greek surgeons would sometimes apply honey directly to wounds, believing that it had healing properties because of its antibacterial qualities. As far-fetched as this might sound, modern science has actually shown that honey can help with wound healing. So, in a way, the Greeks were on to something. even if they didn't know the full science behind it. And then there's the whole concept of surgical ethics, something you wouldn't expect to find in the ancient world. The Greeks, particularly Hippocrates, placed a strong emphasis on the ethical treatment of patients. This is where the Hippocratic Oath comes into play, a document that laid out the principles of medical ethics. The famous line, "Do no harm," which is still recited by doctors today, was essentially born from this oath. While it's hard to imagine a doctor in ancient Greece having the same level of understanding of hygiene and patient care as we do today, there was still a strong moral code when it came to performing surgery. Greek surgeons were expected to work within the limits of their knowledge and skill, not to push patients into dangerous procedures without cause. It wasn't just the surgeons who had a hand in your healing. Greek physicians often worked in tandem with other types of healers. There were pharmacia, the drug experts who mixed potions and medicines. They might not have had the pharmaceutical knowledge we have today, but they did use a variety of herbs, spices, and other natural substances to treat ailments. You might have been prescribed a potion made of garlic, myrrh, or even opium. Yes, you read that correctly, all in an effort to help you recover. Some of these remedies were surprisingly effective, while others ... Well, let's just say you might have ended up more confused than healed. Interestingly, Greek surgery and medicine also left behind some pretty funny moments in history. There were some methods that, looking back, seemed downright ridiculous. For example, when it came to eye infections, Greek doctors sometimes recommended the use of a fish liver ointment. They believed that fish oil had the magical power to heal eye problems. Who knew fish could play such a crucial role in ancient medical practice? While it wasn't the most effective treatment, it's a reminder that even in ancient times, medical science was a mixture of trial, error, and a lot of guesswork. By the time of Galen, a Roman physician who studied and expanded on Greek medicine, many of the surgical techniques we associate with ancient times had evolved significantly. Galen added his own theories about anatomy and surgery, and while not all of his practices were correct, he believed that the liver produced blood. For example, his work laid the groundwork for medieval and Renaissance medical practices. Some of the surgical instruments he used, like scalpels and forceps, wouldn't be too out of place in a modern operating room. But just like with any field, there were also times when Greek surgery went a bit off track. Take the case of phlebotomy or bloodletting. Many ancient Greek physicians believed that draining blood from the body could cure various ailments. Sometimes this method worked, probably due to the placebo effect, but more often than not, it was just a dangerous practice that made patients worse. In the end, ancient Greek surgery was a fascinating mix of science, trial and error, and a bit of superstition. While it's true that their techniques seem primitive by today's standards, they were ahead of their time in many ways, laying the foundation for the medical advancements that came after them. And who knows, maybe if the Greeks had access to modern technology, they could have revolutionized surgery long before anyone else had the chance. Now that we've explored Greek surgery, let's shift gears a bit and take a look at something a little more personal. Ever wondered how the ancient Greeks dealt with the issue of mental health? While we might think of mental health as a modern-day issue, the Greeks were actually among the first to begin considering the mind in connection to the body. They didn't have our fancy therapy sessions, but they had their own ways of addressing mental illness, and, believe it or not, they even had treatments for things like anxiety and depression. So let's get into it, because the Greeks were more ahead of the curve than you might think. In ancient Greece, mental health wasn't just something you toughed out. In fact, the Greeks had a whole range of thoughts and beliefs about what caused mental illness. One of the major theories was that mental illness was caused by an imbalance of the humors, the four bodily fluids that Hippocrates and other Greek thinkers believed controlled human health. If your humors were out of balance, it could cause a range of problems, including mental health issues. So if you were feeling anxious, depressed, or a little off, it might have been blamed on the excess or deficiency of one of these humors. But here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks weren't just looking for cures. They were also trying to understand the causes of mental illness. There was a philosophical approach to mental health, and many Greek thinkers believed that the mind could influence the body and vice versa. One of the most famous proponents of this was the philosopher Socrates, who said that an unexamined life is not worth living. This idea suggested that people need to reflect on their thoughts and emotions in order to lead a balanced life. So, if you were feeling down or out of sorts, Socrates might suggest you take some time to reflect on your life and your choices, kind of like a 5th century BC version of mindfulness. But of course, the Greeks didn't always have the answers. Take Hippocrates, for instance. While he was groundbreaking in many ways, he also believed that mental illness could be caused by supernatural forces, like gods or demons. So, if you were particularly irrational or suffering from what we might call schizophrenia today, it was possible that you were thought to be possessed by spirits. On the other hand, Hippocrates believed that the brain played a big role in mental illness, and he was one of the first to suggest that problems with the brain could cause conditions like epilepsy and even mood disorders. Imagine that mental health is in your head. Hippocrates was kind of the first person to make that connection. While some Greek thinkers might have leaned a bit too heavily on the supernatural, others took a more naturalistic approach. Take Aristotle, for example. He suggested that mental health issues could arise from poor lifestyle choices, like lack of exercise, poor diet, or too much stress. Sound familiar? Well, it's because we're still saying the same thing today. Aristotle also thought that emotional balance was key to a happy life, and that finding a way to moderate your desires and impulses was crucial for mental well-being. So if you were feeling stressed or anxious in ancient Greece, Aristotle might have suggested you take a long walk, eat a healthy meal, and maybe calm your mind with a little meditation, kind of like a 4th century BC wellness coach. But the Greeks didn't just leave it at philosophy. They had a few practical treatments for mental health as well. While you might not have had access to modern antidepressants or therapy sessions, there were some methods to help relieve stress and anxiety. One of the most interesting ones was the use of music. Greek physicians believed that music could have a powerful effect on the soul, and they used it as a form of therapy. Think of it like the ancient equivalent of listening to a calming playlist or going to a music therapy session. Certain instruments, like the lyre or flute, were thought to have a healing effect on the mind, and music was often used in temple rituals or even in private healing sessions to help people relax and restore balance. The Greeks also had a practice that seems oddly familiar: counseling, or what they called therapy. While it wasn't exactly the same as modern psychotherapy, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle often acted as life coaches of sorts, guiding people through their problems and helping them find clarity. If you were feeling depressed, anxious, or confused, you might visit a philosopher who would engage you in dialogue and help you find the root of your emotional turmoil. While these sessions didn't involve a couch or a lot of deep psychological theory, they were a kind of early form of mental health support. And then, of course, there was the option of purgation, a fancy word for cleansing. If you were feeling bogged down by negative emotions, Greeks believed that sometimes the best way to deal with it was to purge the bad feelings through things like fasting, sweating, or even vomiting. This might sound a little extreme, but the Greeks believed that by physically ridding your body of impurities, you could clear your mind and reset your emotional state. You could think of it as a kind of emotional detox, but not everyone agreed on the best way to treat mental illness. Some Greek thinkers, like Pythagoras, yes, the guy with the theorem, believed that mental health could be affected by an imbalance in your environment or by things like noise and excess. He thought that if you surrounded yourself with too much chaos, too many loud noises or unsettling sights, it could disturb your mind and lead to mental distress. So, to counteract this, he recommended quiet, calm spaces and even suggested that certain colors could affect your mood. Kind of ahead of his time, don't you think? As you can imagine, these treatments didn't always work, but they were part of a much larger framework that the Greeks used to try and understand the complex relationship between the body and the mind. What is fascinating is that many of the ideas they had about mental health are still being explored today. Sure, we've advanced in terms of technology, but the basic concepts the Greeks laid out, balancing the mind, the body, and the spirit, are just as relevant now as they were 2,500 years ago. Now that we've seen how the ancient Greeks approached the mind and body, it's time to wrap up our exploration of Greek health with something a little more practical: diet and nutrition. We all know that eating right is key to staying healthy, but the Greeks were way ahead of us in recognizing the importance of a balanced diet. Sure, they didn't have kale smoothies or protein powders, but they had some solid ideas about what to eat and, more importantly, how to eat it. So let's take a look at the Greeks' relationship with food and how it influenced their overall health. One of the key concepts in ancient Greek dietary philosophy was the idea of moderation. The Greeks were all about balance, not just in health but in every aspect of life. When it came to food, they didn't believe in indulging too much or fasting to extremes. The idea was simple: eat what you need to fuel your body, but don't overdo it. This idea of moderation came from the Greek belief in symmetry, that the body and mind function best when in balance. So if you ate too much or too little, it would throw off your health, just like if your body was out of proportion. One of the most well-known Greek dietary principles was eating in the Mediterranean style, long before it became trendy. The Greeks, particularly in the classical era, based their diet around whole grains, vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, and a little bit of fish. Olive oil was a staple in their diet, not just for cooking, but as a dressing and for dipping bread. The Mediterranean diet we now champion as healthy was actually a practice of balance and moderation that the Greeks followed long ago. They didn't have fancy superfoods like quinoa or chia seeds, but they did have fresh, seasonal foods that were nutrient-dense and easy to digest. Speaking of bread, yes, the Greeks loved their bread, but they didn't just eat white bread. Like many of us might today, the Greeks mostly ate whole wheat bread, which was high in fiber and kept them feeling full longer. They also paired bread with a variety of toppings, such as olives, cheese, and fresh vegetables, making their meals both satisfying and nutritious. Meat was a little less common in the Greek diet, though it wasn't absent. Meat was considered more of a luxury, often reserved for special occasions, sacrifices to the gods, or large communal feasts. When the Greeks did eat meat, it was usually lamb, goat, or poultry, and it was often cooked with herbs, which they believed had both flavor and medicinal qualities. You could say the Greek diet was naturally paleo, but with more emphasis on vegetables and grains. Let's not forget the wine. Oh yes, wine was a big part of Greek culture, and it wasn't just for the parties. The Greeks believed that wine, when consumed in moderation, had medicinal properties. Wine was used to aid digestion, soothe the stomach, and even treat wounds. In fact, they would often mix their wine with water. It was considered scandalous to drink it straight, and it was part of their daily routine, especially during meals. The social aspect of wine drinking was also significant, as it fostered bonding and communication during gatherings. Some philosophers even believe that the act of drinking wine together helped with intellectual discussions, kind of like a 4th century BC version of wine and debate. But the Greeks didn't just focus on what you ate. They were also obsessed with when you ate. They had a strong belief in the importance of timing and ritual when it came to meals. They didn't just scarf down their food whenever they felt hungry. Mealtime was a carefully planned event. For example, they believed that the best time to eat was in the afternoon, as it gave your body time to digest before bedtime. They also believed in the concept of fasting, but not in the extreme sense that we think of today. The Greeks would sometimes skip meals or fast on specific days to cleanse their bodies and reset their digestive systems. Fasting was seen as a way to enhance physical and mental clarity, and it was incorporated into religious practices and philosophy. But here is something fascinating. The Greeks also had a unique take on digestion, and it wasn't just about how food made it into your stomach. They believed that your body processed food through a series of steps that involved both physical and spiritual elements. For the Greeks, digestion wasn't merely about breaking down food into nutrients, it was also about absorbing the essence of life. This might sound a bit mystical, but it reflects the Greeks' holistic approach to health, where body and spirit were intertwined. In addition to this, the Greeks had specific foods for specific ailments. If you were feeling run down, you might be prescribed a meal of lentils or chickpeas, as they believed these legumes had restorative properties. Garlic, another staple of the Greek diet, was considered a powerful natural medicine and was often used to treat a variety of conditions, from digestive problems to infections. Interestingly enough, modern science has validated many of the health benefits of these foods, proving that the Greeks knew a thing or two about nutrition long before we had the scientific evidence to back it up. Interestingly, the Greeks also had specific dietary rules for athletes, especially those training for the ancient Olympic Games. Athletes were encouraged to consume foods that would enhance their stamina and strength. These meals typically included lean proteins, vegetables, fruits, and barley, which was thought to be a great energy source. One of the more popular foods among athletes was figs, which they believe were ideal for providing quick energy. The Greeks even had a tradition where victorious athletes would offer sacrifices of honey cakes, fruits, and other foods to the gods in gratitude for their success. It seems that the Greeks were one of the first to recognize the importance of nutrition in athletic performance, a practice we still follow today. Of course, no discussion of Greek food would be complete without mentioning their herbs and spices. The Greeks were big fans of using herbs not just for flavor, but for their medicinal properties. Herbs like oregano, thyme, and mint were commonly used in cooking and were believed to have therapeutic benefits. The use of herbal teas also became widespread, with certain blends used to treat colds, digestive issues, and even insomnia. It's no surprise that many of these herbs are still found in modern health remedies and teas. So while we might not be eating the same exact foods the Greeks ate today, there are certainly lessons you can learn from their approach to food and health. They understood that balance, moderation, and a connection between mind, body, and food were key to overall well-being, and those principles are just as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. As we wrap up our deep dive into ancient Greek health practices, let's take a moment to reflect on the legacy the Greeks left behind in terms of wellness and medicine. While they didn't have the sophisticated medical technology we rely on today, their approach to health was based on a philosophy that centered on balance, moderation, and a deep connection between the body, mind, and spirit. In many ways, their practices laid the groundwork for modern medicine, and some of their principles are still applicable to our lives today. One of the most enduring contributions of ancient Greek health practices is the idea of holistic health, the belief that true well-being comes from a balance of the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of life. This wasn't just a passing thought for the Greeks. It was embedded in their daily routines, their diets, and even their philosophy. The concept of balance wasn't limited to just their physical health. It extended to their emotional, social, and intellectual lives as well. This is why they focused so much on maintaining a balance between work and leisure, physical exercise and rest, and even the food they ate and the ways they approach their spiritual and philosophical development. Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all understood the importance of a well-rounded life. Socrates, in particular, emphasized the need for self-reflection and the pursuit of knowledge, not just as a way to cultivate the intellect, but also to achieve emotional and spiritual balance. Plato, on the other hand, believed that achieving harmony within oneself and society was key to true happiness, and Aristotle argued that living a life of moderation, avoiding extremes in all aspects of life, was the key to moral and physical well-being. These ideas were revolutionary at the time, and in many ways, they are still shaping our approaches to health today. One of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Greek health practices is their attention to the mind-body connection. While the modern understanding of mental health has only really taken shape in recent decades, the Greeks were already grappling with the idea that the mind could affect the body and vice versa. They recognized that emotional states like anxiety, fear, and depression could have physical manifestations, and they sought to address those imbalances through philosophy, exercise, diet, and even music. The fact that the Greeks placed such a high value on mental health alongside physical health was groundbreaking, and it's something we can still learn from today. In a similar vein, the Greeks' focus on exercise and physical fitness is another area where their practices still resonate today. From the Olympic Games to everyday physical routines, the Greeks were among the first to recognize the importance of regular exercise for maintaining both physical and mental health. They understood that a fit body was crucial for a fit mind, and they practiced a variety of exercises from running and wrestling to swimming and ball games that helped maintain their strength, endurance, and overall well-being. This mindset laid the foundation for our modern fitness culture, where people are encouraged to stay active for the sake of both their body and their mind. But perhaps the most important lesson you can learn from the ancient Greeks is their commitment to preventative health. While they didn't have the advanced medical tools we do today, they knew that the best way to stay healthy was to prevent illness before it started. This meant adopting healthy lifestyle habits, like eating a balanced diet, exercising regularly, getting enough rest, and avoiding excess. It also meant paying attention to mental health and practicing mindfulness, reflection, and self-care. The Greeks understood that true health didn't come from simply treating symptoms when they appeared. It came from living in a way that minimized the risk of disease and promoted long-term well-being. So, what can we take away from all of this? First, it's clear that the ancient Greeks had a surprisingly advanced understanding of health for their time. Their philosophy, balance, moderation, and holistic care remains as relevant today as it was back then. In a world where we often find ourselves overwhelmed by stress, illness, and an overabundance of choices, the Greeks' emphasis on moderation and thoughtful living offers a much-needed reminder of what it means to live well. Next, their approach to mental health and the importance they placed on self-reflection, emotional balance, and philosophical inquiry offers us a timeless blueprint for nurturing our minds. In a time when mental health is increasingly recognized as a critical component of overall well-being, the Greeks were pioneers in seeing the connection between mind and body, showing us that tending to our emotional and mental health is just as vital as looking after our physical health. Finally, the Greeks' understanding of nutrition, exercise, and preventative care serves as a reminder that good health is a lifelong pursuit, one that requires attention, commitment, and a holistic approach. Whether we're eating the foods that nourish us, engaging in physical activities that keep our bodies strong, or taking time to reflect and nurture our emotional well-being, we can look back on the lessons of ancient Greece to guide us toward healthier, more fulfilling lives in the end. While the ancient Greeks may have lived long before the advent of modern medicine, their ideas and practices still shape how we think about health today. They recognize that true wellness doesn't come from just one aspect of life. It comes from living a balanced, harmonious existence where body, mind, and spirit work together in sync. And if we can take even a small part of that wisdom into our own lives, we'll be better off for it. It seems we've covered a lot of ground about the ancient Greeks and their approach to health. But there is one more topic we could explore that ties everything together: the idea of self-care in Greek society and its importance across generations. It is not just about physical health or mental clarity. It is about nurturing yourself as a whole person on a regular, almost ritualistic basis. And while self-care is a buzzword today, the Greeks were already practicing it thousands of years ago. In many ways, the Greeks believed that self-care was an active choice, not just a luxury or indulgence. They had an entire framework of practices that would now be considered self-care. Philosophers like Epicurus advocated for taking time to cultivate simple pleasures in life, whether it was a quiet moment of reflection, sharing a meal with loved ones, or simply being in nature. These moments weren't just about enjoyment. They were viewed as essential for recharging the mind and spirit, ensuring that individuals stayed balanced and healthy. Physical self-care was also a priority. The Greeks placed high value on exercise, hygiene, and rest. It wasn't just about going to the gym or running a race. It was about creating a lifestyle where the body was treated with respect. The Greeks used bathing as a form of ritual, and their gymnasiums weren't just for physical training. They were places for relaxation, mental rejuvenation, and socialization. The baths were places for both personal hygiene and self-reflection, and philosophers often used these settings to engage in deep discussions about life. They were essentially the ancient version of a spa day minus the facials. Then there's the concept of leisure. For the Greeks, leisure didn't mean laziness. It was about taking the time to rest in a purposeful way, to be rather than always do. Their idea of leisure was rooted in the belief that one needed to take breaks from daily labor to recharge both the mind and body. Whether it was through conversation, walking in nature, or enjoying art, leisure was seen as a necessary part of a balanced life. They believed that true happiness came not from relentless work, but from moments of pause, reflection, and contentment. Interestingly, this idea of leisure and self-care was also linked to their spiritual practices. In ancient Greece, taking time to honor the gods, whether through rituals, prayers, or festivals, was seen as a way to reconnect with the greater forces of the universe and restore balance. Even though most of us no longer live in a world where we actively worship the same gods, the spirit of those practices, the importance of taking time to pause, reflect, and find meaning can be adapted into our own routines. And what about the Greeks' attention to the inner self? Socrates famously said, "Know thyself." And this was more than just a philosophical pursuit. It was an integral part of mental and emotional well-being. The act of self-reflection, of questioning one's thoughts and emotions, was seen as a way to ensure that the mind remained clear and balanced. For the Greeks, self-care didn't just mean pampering the body, it meant taking time to understand the mind and the emotions as well. Journaling, meditative practices, and philosophical dialogues were all tools that allowed individuals to engage in this process of self-discovery. And even today, the act of journaling or engaging in reflective thought is one of the most effective ways to maintain mental health and clarity. The Greeks also had an interesting relationship with stress management. Modern life can often feel overwhelming, and the Greeks were no strangers to that. But they had their own ways of managing stress and anxiety. Their approach wasn't about escaping the stressors of life, it was about cultivating resilience and mindfulness. For instance, Epicurus believed that by focusing on simple pleasures and minimizing unnecessary desires, one could achieve lasting happiness. Instead of chasing after external achievements, he advocated for finding joy in the small, present moments, much like we might practice mindfulness today. Their practices around balance, moderation, and mindful living resonate deeply in today's fast-paced world. The focus on holistic health, where mental, emotional, and physical health are all considered equally important, helps us realize that self-care isn't just about treating symptoms of stress or illness, but about creating a lifestyle that nurtures our overall well-being. This concept of care for the self in a comprehensive sense is something we can learn from the Greeks as we navigate our own busy, modern lives. By reflecting on the way the Greeks treated their bodies and minds, we come to realize that the foundation of self-care, whether it's eating well, exercising, or taking time for mindfulness, was something they practiced centuries ago. If they were here today, they'd probably remind us that good health is not just a goal, but a continuous journey, a way of being that requires attention, intention, and care. In a way, the ancient Greeks were the original wellness gurus, offering us timeless wisdom that still applies to our lives. Their teachings about moderation, balance, and the importance of taking care of the whole self remind us that health isn't a destination, it's a lifestyle. So, as you reflect on your own health practices, whether it's in the gym, in the kitchen, or in your personal reflections, remember that the Greeks had it figured out long before we did, and we can still learn a lot from their approach to living well. It seems we've come full circle with a comprehensive look at ancient Greek health practices, but there is always room to delve deeper into certain aspects of their approach to well-being that might provide even more insights. Let us take one final deep dive into something that I think ties everything together: the Greek concept of the good life, and how it is still relevant to us today. In ancient Greece, the idea of living a good life wasn't just about having material wealth or achieving fame. It was rooted in eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or happiness. But this wasn't just any happiness, it was a holistic, enduring happiness that came from living in harmony with yourself, society, and the greater universe. The concept of eudaimonia was a core idea in Greek philosophy, especially for Aristotle, who believed that the key to living a good life lay in fulfilling one's true potential and living virtuously. So, what does that mean for us today? Well, it's not as far-fetched as it might seem. If we break it down, eudaimonia is about living in accordance with your values, nurturing relationships that matter, seeking wisdom, and taking care of both body and mind in a balanced way. It's about purposeful living, not just aiming for temporary pleasure or success. Whether we realize it or not, this pursuit is what many of us are actually seeking, whether through mindfulness practices, setting long-term goals, or building meaningful connections. For Aristotle, the pursuit of eudaimonia meant striving for virtue, living in a way that encourages moral excellence, self-discipline, and empathy toward others. It is striking how much this reflects modern ideas about wellness and self-improvement. We now know that pursuing a purpose that aligns with one's core values leads to deeper life satisfaction. People who focus on developing skills, cultivating strong relationships, and contributing to something bigger than themselves tend to report higher well-being. Eudaimonia and its pursuit through virtue isn't just ancient Greek philosophy, it's the foundation of modern well-being practices. Let's also look at Socrates and Plato, who both emphasize self-examination and rational thought as crucial aspects of living well. For Socrates, the unexamined life wasn't worth living, suggesting that introspection, understanding our desires, and aligning them with what truly matters is essential to a flourishing life. This is another thread we see in modern wellness trends. Self-awareness is a critical part of mental health. Practices like journaling, therapy, or even the mindfulness movement all stem from the same idea of reflecting on our inner world in order to align ourselves with a more authentic, fulfilling life. So how do we tie this all together? Greek health practices weren't just about maintaining the body and mind, they were about living a meaningful life. This brings us back to holistic wellness, which is really about achieving harmony in all aspects of life: physical health, mental clarity, emotional balance, and a sense of purpose. The Greeks understood that living well required more than just healthy food or exercise. It was about embracing an active, thoughtful approach to life, a life in which one practices virtue, engages in self-reflection, seeks balance, and contributes meaningfully to society. And whether you're sipping a cup of herbal tea, reflecting on your day, or even exercising with intention, these ancient practices of living well still offer us a powerful framework for navigating our modern lives. In closing, the Greeks didn't just give us medicine, they gave us an entire philosophy of living. They taught us that health isn't merely the absence of disease, but a dynamic, ongoing process of balancing our mind, body, and spirit. So, as we go about our busy modern lives, perhaps we can all take a moment to remember the wisdom of those ancient thinkers and live our lives with intention, just as the Greeks did. By incorporating their principles of balance, virtue, and reflection into our daily routines, we can move closer to living a life of true eudaimonia, where health and happiness are not just goals, but ways of being. And with that, we're able to nurture not just our bodies, but the deeper, richer experiences that make life worth living.